Okay, far away. Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi. The 5,783rd pasuk of the Torah is Ki lo ketzurenu tzuram v'oivenu pelilim. Rashi translates the latter half of the pasuk as our enemies will be our judges. However, the Ibn Ezra translates it as that our enemies must admit that their deity could not stand against Israel's God, and they should understand that the downfall of his people was not the victory of their God, but divine punishment. As such, and since we know that the Beis Din of Shemayim follows the Beis Din of earth, is there anything we could do on a personal level, or, and this might be on a national level, to make it an Ibn Ezra year?
It's not. All of the comments of the great commentators express true dimensions of the text. It's not a question of one or the other. It's not a question of forcing one or forcing the other. That's not the way to look at the way in which the commentators reveal to us aspects of the text. That's one thing. The other thing is you slide comfortably from Beis Din, which is a court, to the individual, to the nation. I mean, we're talking about vastly different powers and vastly different levers of access to divine decision. So I don't think you can just lump the three of them together. One thing you just have to know that divine providence takes everything into account. Everything that every individual does, everything that every group does, everything that the nation does, it's all taken into account. And I think the healthy attitude is I'm going to do what I can to add to the positive side. And then to leave the calculations and ultimate decisions up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's sort of like asking two privates in the field, in the middle of the war, what strategy do you think the general ought to follow, or what should we do to push forward the general's strategy? The answer is follow orders. That's what you can do, and that's the best way in which you can help. More than that, I don't think we can say. Yeah.
Can Jewish philosophy provide any new insights or concepts into modern academic philosophical discourse and literature?
I suppose there are comments here and there which express insights, but contemporary philosophy comes in two dimensions. There's what's called pure philosophy and philosophy of. Pure philosophy is usually divided into epistemology, metaphysics, and value theory. And then there's philosophy of language, philosophy of law, and philosophy of science, and philosophy of mathematics. And the philosophy ofs take a particular form that's in operation, and they analyze how it works and what its dynamics are, what its principles are, and what principles might be used other than those principles, and how it's validated. But it starts with the going concern. I would say the vast, vast majority of philosophy in Jewish sources is philosophy of. It includes philosophy of law, where I think I'm studying philosophy of law, but I would imagine there would be substantial contributions to be made. There's been an enormous amount of effort put into the idea of law. There's certainly a lot of ethics, but not abstract foundational ethics, but rather ethical argumentation as to if you take this particular position, what are the consequences, and what could you do to modify it to make it consistent with that principle, and so forth and so on. There's a lot of that. There's certainly a great deal of theology. Theology is a branch of philosophy of religion, so certainly something to be said for that. But almost all Jewish philosophical thought is in service of something else. It's not thought for thought's sake. It's thought for directing action. It's thought for constituting the community in a way that complies with divine law. It's thought for the sake of accomplishing something else. And that gives it a certain focus that philosophical discourse typically doesn't have. So that might be something which would make traditional philosophers cautious about.
What do you mean by that last point? It's thought for the sake of something else? Like, how does that contrast with modern philosophy?
My philosophy, the pretense is we are trying to understand. Why are you trying to understand? Because that's what we do. We try to understand. Here, everything is ultimately to be able to serve God better. Not understanding for the sake of understanding. God forbid that anything would be detached from serving God better. So there's a goal at the end of the process, which guides the process as you go along. Now, I could hear a philosopher say, "Well, that's a terrible prejudice. It's a terrible distortion, because then you're not just understanding it for the sake of understanding it." And our response would be, "Absolutely right. That we're not doing that. Thank you very much." So, I mean,
Does that apply to all areas of philosophy, or just Jewish philosophy that mindset should be held?
no. I made a remark about Jewish philosophy. Jewish philosophy has a goal other than just understanding. That was a remark about Jewish philosophy, not about other
I
philosophies.
mean, like, if a Jewish philosopher likes to philosophize about other subjects outside of Jewish philosophy, should that also be his goal for the sake of God?
There is no such thing as living without the goal of serving God. That's the only goal there is. So of course, he shouldn't do it if he plays baseball. He shouldn't do it when he's eating. Shouldn't do it when he's sleeping or taking a vacation in the Mediterranean. I mean, at all times, his thought should be, how can I serve God by what I'm doing? It's just nothing else about philosophy. It's just that's life from a Jewish point of view. Yeah.
Oh, I have a few questions on the idea of existence. The first one is there anything that can exist independently? Meaning, like, are there, in terms of the word existence itself, like, what's the,
Independent of what?
like, without any dependence on anything, like self-sufficient creature?
Well, I guess it depends a little bit on what your background picture of the world is. From our point of view, nothing can exist independently of God. But that's because of our religious standpoint. It's not because a philosophical analysis would lead you to that conclusion. So I mean, it's it's that sort of saying, what things are moving? Well, moving with respect to what? Things don't just move; they move with respect to something else. You say independent; it's got to be independent of what? Of government, of food, of air, of gravity, independent of mind, independent of what? If you don't tell me of what, I can't answer the question.
And the second one is there, in terms of the word existence, is it different than reality, like the existence of something?
People, these are very slippery words, existence, reality, and all the rest, and different people use them in different ways, and I'm not here to tell people how to talk. The way I use the words, no, there isn't any difference.
Okay. And then the last question is living different than being alive? I know it doesn't really have to do much with existence itself.
Again, living and being alive, it's going to depend upon how you talk. I can't make any, if I give you an answer, you say, well, he said that's the way to talk. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not telling people how to talk. But there is a difference in the grammar, which I think some people would pay attention to. Living is a state of being, whereas being alive is also a state of being. Some people might take living as a verb, something you do, not something you are. Being alive is something you are, but it's more or less arbitrary. There's nothing deep here. It's just idiosyncratic ways of using words.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How can we understand David not being able to even consider to kill Shaul? That's the question.
How can we understand David not?
That he explicitly refuses in any sense to hurt or to kill Shaul.
To hurt or kill Shaul? How can we understand that? He's the king of Israel. Shaul is the rightful king of Israel. What do you mean? How could it be otherwise? How could he imagine hurting him or killing him? How could he imagine such a thing?
For two reasons. He has already been anointed, and Shaul has been trying to kill him. So I have an understanding that if someone is trying to kill you, perhaps you might defend yourself. But David explicitly.
So first of all, someone is trying to kill you. if you can escape without killing him, then there are those who will say that you shouldn't kill him. If you can escape without killing him, then you don't kill him. Just like if you see A trying to kill B, you don't just kill A. You stop A from killing B. You stop him. If you could stop him without killing him and you kill him, you're a murderer. If you could stop A from killing B without killing A, and you kill A, you're a murderer. You have to stop him without killing him. Hashke l'horgo may mean that it's permissible because of his viciousness. But, and then the fact that he was anointed to be king. But he certainly didn't take over the position of king. He wasn't playing the role of king. Indeed, at that point in time, if I'm not mistaken, Shaul was not yet deposed. The war with Amalek had not taken place yet. It wasn't announced that it was that he will be king, not that he was king. His brothers treated him with contempt even after it happened.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a specific portion that says that Shmuel told Shaul, "You are done." When he didn't kill the king of Amalek,
Right, but that was later.
He was still the king.
But
after that, like after he didn't kill the king of Amalek, he kept on being the king, and he kept on pursuing David.
yes, but that's a different matter because then he was told by a prophet that he's finished.
And still he was the king.
Sorry?
And still he kept on being the king. Like that.
But we're not now talking about politics. We're not now talking about running the army. We're talking about his authority. His authority. A person can steal the position of king also. He can kill the previous king and take over. I mean, there are people who do all sorts of things. But at the time that David was anointed, Saul was the rightful king. Yeah. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question, Rabbi. So, calendar kind of question, also philosophical. So, a lot of goyim in a lot of parts of the world right now, and actually close to the end of October, they celebrate a holiday which is called Halloween, American holiday, right? We Jews, as far as I understand, we have only one rightful and strong force in our world, which is Hashem, right? But although it is true, the Jews throughout their history, especially during the Middle Ages and etc., they, and actually a lot of Hasidim as well, not only in the Middle Ages, they believed in a lot of superstitious things, and they indeed had been cautious about the idea of fearing other things, which is also all these products of God, but Hashem, but whatever. So my question is, in your opinion, how much of the superstitious traditions are still in place in modern day Judaism, in modern day our traditions, and which of them are indeed important for us? Perhaps it is important indeed to fear a bit have a little bit of fear, because Halloween, the soul of Halloween, and a lot of other Jewish holidays, goyim holidays, are the idea of fearing and believing. So, what's your opinion on our fearing nowadays?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I would agree with your premise that the medieval Jews absorbed a lot of superstitious beliefs. I would like to know which expert declared them superstitious and declared them false. Yeah, if they are our experts who said that we shouldn't have these ideas or customs, but there are a lot of external so-called scholars who would condemn mitzvahs in the Torah as superstitious. So I'm not certainly buying into the general statement. We have our sources will say, let's say with respect to customs, there's something called the minhag shtus, where a person or a community has taken on a particular practice, and the authorities will say that it's foolish, it has no basis whatsoever, and it shouldn't be done. We have such things. Well, all you do is look in the books and see which ones the rightful authorities have condemned, and you know which ones which are so. But the vocabulary you're using is not the vocabulary from inside, but outside. And I would recommend you check the sources carefully to see whether the information you have is correct. If the internal sources have said that they are foolish and without basis, then of course they should be discarded. If they haven't said so, then they should not be discarded. There's nothing profound here. As far as I know, going around in masked costumes and putting poison in the candy and knives in the candy and so on is not something that we do. We're not afraid of it. We wouldn't participate in it. It's just more of the surrounding culture.
In any short notice, any Jewish museum which is at least a bit connected to the medieval Jewish history, it's very easy to see a lot of amulets, especially by the way in the Ukrainian Jewish settlements, amulets and a lot of other things which indeed connect us to the
Amulets are in the Gemara, excuse me, and the criteria for using amulets is in the Gemara.
So
That's
what's the
1,500 years ago. Give me a break on Ukraine and the medieval Jewish history. It's definitely genuine and it definitely is true and so forth and so on. Not everybody does it in the right way. But if you think amulets are an example of a superstitious belief that came into the Middle Ages, that's a piece of misinformation of the kind that I'm talking about. These museums, unless they have strong rabbinic authorities behind them, are full of mistakes, full of fantasies, full of made-up stories, and you should not trust them. You should not trust them.
There is even a book which is specifically devoted, which is written, by the way, by a very important scientist from Israel, right? It's specifically devoted to the idea of Jewish demons and how Jewish people throughout their history believed in a lot of demons.
Well, good for him. But Shadim in the Gemara probably is one of the examples.
Gemara, yeah, he's
Well, good. So, but then he's wrong. He's wrong.
quoting Gemara, though. How can Gemara be wrong?
No, he's wrong. This fellow is wrong. This fellow thinks that these are superstitious beliefs of Jews. They are beliefs in true realities, and he's just following the current intellectual fashions of calling them superstitions.
Okay, adjective.
So, but this shows you. I want you to learn something from this. That the sources that you trust are still the kinds of sources that put a PROF in front of their names.
Right.
I've been there and done that, right? I taught university for 10 years,
Right.
and I've talked to these people and discussed and debated with these people, and I think that the immense respect and assumption of validity and authority is very, very much overdone, and you should be suspicious, not take it for granted because somebody wrote a book and it was sold in a museum that he knows what he's talking about. He's expressing the prejudices of the current intellectual styles. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, you had a question?
Could the Rav go over the main reasons for the Torah and like why just the main reason why we accept each one?
Oh, sure. We have a week, right? Like 2 hours a day. Just Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat Peh. And the main reasons for accepting, okay. I think I'm going to cut it down from 100 points to about 2. Okay. It is obvious to anyone who reads the written Torah, takes it seriously, and tries to understand it, that it's incomplete. It is necessarily incomplete. There is no way that this book could have been accepted by a people and used to regulate their lives if all they had was what's written in the book. That would be impossible. You must understand that there always was an oral context accompanying the book. And indeed, if you look at what the book says that it was written by Moses at the end of his life. The book was written at the end of his life. What was going on in the previous years? Moses was teaching the oral Torah to the Jewish people for 39 years before the book was written. The oral Torah came first. The written Torah came afterwards. So as Rav Hirsch says, you could look, with a rough analogy, at the written Torah as lecture notes for someone who heard the lecture and made notes for himself afterwards to remember what he heard in the lecture. It isn't as if the oral tradition was invented 300 years later to explain the book after the book by other people. The exact opposite is true. So people ask why certain things aren't written. Because everybody knew them. Because they've been learning them for 39 years. Right? So I think that, therefore, if you try to understand the book without the oral context that was in existence at that time, it's hopeless. And I will make now a deeply prejudiced remark. This is one of the famous tricks of Christian missionaries. They'll say to a Jew, "You believe X?" And he thinks, "Yeah, I was taught that when I was 9 years old in Sunday school." And they say, "Well, where is it in your book? Show me in your book where it says so. If not, then they lied to you and they took it from someplace else and so forth and so on." And what the poor Jew, who's now 26, doesn't know is that a great deal of the information that we received from Moses was oral. All was oral, started out with, that's not written in the book. And that doesn't mean we took it from somebody else, and that doesn't mean it's not genuine. So the starting point for the oral tradition is an absolute necessity in order to understand the book as it stands. And I'll just give you two examples. One where Rashi actually says this in Deuteronomy 12:21, which I remember because it's backwards. It says, you want to have a barbecue and you're worried that you have to go to the temple to offer the sacrifice and eat the remains of the sacrifice? Not on your life. You're living in Beersheba, you're living in Tiberia, have a barbecue at home. Have a good time. Just one thing. Make sure that you slaughter the animal as I commanded you. Aha. I'm reading the book. See? It says, slaughter the animal as I commanded you. As you commanded me. What chapter is that in? What book is that? There's 1,000 pages here. Could you give me a footnote, a reference? There's nothing. There's not a hint in 1,000 pages of the Tanakh how to slaughter animals. Nowhere. So Rashi says, obviously the reader of the book had other information available to him with which he could understand how you're commanded to slaughter. This shows you that there was an oral tradition that accompanied it. And the granddaddy of the legal system is Shabbos. You're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos. Nowhere is there a definition of malacha. Nowhere. And there are thousands of cases which would be, can you sign your name? Can you water a plant? No. Can you rip paper to size? There are 1,000 things which nowhere in the word malacha are you going to get a definition as to whether you can or whether you can't. Can you knock down a house in order later to build a new house on the lot? Is that just called pure destructive, or is that constructive enough because later on you're going to build a house on the lot? Yeah. It's a capital crime. To violate Shabbos is a capital crime. So you bring him in before the court, and the judge says, what did he do? He violated Shabbos. Oh, yeah? What did he do? He did X, Y, Z. And the judge says, yeah, but it's X, Y, Z, violation of the Shabbos law. I don't know. I mean, the Shabbos law is 6 words. Don't do malacha. End of story. On to the next subject. How are we supposed to run a whole nation and a whole institution like Shabbos on 6 words? Obviously, there was an entire oral tradition together with the written. So the idea of the oral having been come later and been arbitrary and made up and so forth and so on, if you take the book seriously, you've got to have a very sizable oral tradition to go with it. Otherwise, it's impossible to imagine putting into practice. That's the first key element that has to be understood. Yeah.
Based on that, would that mean, let's say, in the Gemara, where it makes a drasha from a pasuk that's in Devarim, would that mean they were just taught the premises and then they were shown how that fits into pasuk as opposed to how we see it, which is a pasuk and then we see what they got out of that pasuk?
Not sure I'm understanding your question.
You're saying that they got let's say for example, Devarim, they got the oral tradition before they actually received the written tradition.
That's right.
So therefore, when they learnt it, they would have learnt. Let's say when we come across it, we learn the written tradition. We see what we learn from that from the oral tradition.
Well, first of all, okay, there are two things to say here. First of all, not everything that we have in our corpus of Jewish law was presented by Moses to the people at all. Later deductions were made, later arguments were made, later analyses were made, and later applications were made. Now, when you talk about a verse and let's say and a law, and they're related in the Gemara, there are 2 different types of relationships, and this is quite tricky. You have to. It's not labeled, different font, different point size. No, and sometimes by the argumentation you could tell. Sometimes the relationship between the verse and the law is a matching problem. Like you have matching questions on an exam. Oh, that's great because a couple are obvious. That knocks out some of the alternatives, and then you can figure out by elimination. And right. Sometimes you have a whole list of verses, the whole book, and you have a whole list of laws given to you. The laws are already there, you have them, you've memorized them, and you're supposed to find the match and see how they match. So you find a verse which indicates that law, indicates it in context and so forth and so on. This is, Maimonides and others say, it's part of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, to match up laws with verses. Other times, you're trying to determine what the law is, and you're examining the verses to deduce from the verse what the law should be. Those are very, very different. And the Talmud contains both. And one way you can tell is that certain discussions in the Talmud go like this. Someone will say, I learned this law from this verse. And someone else will say, gee, I don't learn that law from this. I learned this law from that verse. So then they'll say back to him, well then, where do you learn this law from? So I learned from that verse. So then what do you do with that verse? What law do you learn from that verse? That law. Okay, but then where do you learn that law from? From this verse. And they keep going on like that, right? That's where it's a matching exercise. When it's not a matching exercise, it goes like this. He learns this law from this verse, and he says, no, I learned that law from this, and therefore I disagree with that law, because I don't use that verse for that law. So I don't think that law is right. End of discussion. Not where do you get it from, and how do you get it, and what do you do with that? There's nowhere else to go, because he's deducing it. The other says, I don't believe in your deduction, so I don't believe in your law. So you have both kinds of discussions in the Talmud. You be very careful when it says, Mino Hanamili, where do these words come from, which kind of discussion it is. That's one fundamental thing to keep in mind. There are other subtleties as well, but so that's one fundamental thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
Speaking of laws, I want to continue this question and this topic. So it's not a secret that a lot of modern day topics require a lot of modern day commentaries from the big Rav Poskim, right? And Rav Kanevsky and all the other Ravs have been very much concentrated on revealing the problems and the essential things to the people, right? But there was no, as far as I understand, please correct me if I am wrong, the basic book, which would collect all the commentaries about the modern day issues and perhaps include all the issues, like Shulchan Aruch, but
issues.
Modern day Shulchan Aruch, right?
Yeah.
So my question is like this: in your opinion, is there a need of modern day Shulchan Aruch, a big kind of a collection of commentaries and laws, right? If there is a need, if there is a need, how can we expect it to be done?
Yeah. No, I don't think there's a need for another Shulchan Aruch. What you have today instead is maybe hundreds of books which give a comprehensive collection of all the laws on a particular subject. For example, Ribis, not taking interest on loans, there is a famous sefer that was put out by a Rav a number of years ago that's 500 pages long on Ribis. That collects together all the laws on Ribis. You have many, many, many such svarim. Many. Well, why should it be collected into one work by one person and put into order? Well, there's no particular reason for that. The order of the laws has been set for us by the original Shulchan Aruch. We follow that order, but the literature that's accumulated and is always being accumulated. Dirshu, as a worldwide movement, has put out editions which has incorporated a great deal of that material. For example, they put out an edition of the Mishnah Brura with collections from the later responsa literature for many, many hundreds of modern questions, which up until 10 years ago when it came out, it was very current. So this kind of thing is going on all the time, and therefore I remember about 35 years ago when a whole sefer came out on second day Yom Tov, just on the second day of Yom Tov. Right. And it was like 300 pages. So, or Muktzah, you have many collections on Muktzah. So this definitely exists, and it's being updated all the time.
But sorry, just to make sure. So basically, as far as I understand, Shulchan Aruch was also good, not only because it was unique and genius work, right, of collection, but also because it was it was possible for a lot of Jews, simple Jews, or like above or a bit above than simple, just open Shulchan Aruch and try to understand the laws by themselves. So isn't there like a problem in modern days that person cannot just take one Shulchan Aruch and just understand what's going on with this tradition, which is like very important in current days, like
well, you do. I'm sorry, you do have that. You do have introductions to areas of law which lay out the basic principles. For Shabbos, there are many such introductions, like 100 pages, 150 pages, and you have the basic. But of course, you won't get all the details. You won't get all the argumentation. Of course.
But this also okay. But it means you agreed then that this means that a modern day person would not be able to just get one book and just understand how can I use smartphone on Yom Rishon, whatever.
Again, that's like saying that there are no books on medicine because surgery requires 4 years of college. That's not true. There are books that give you general outlines. They give you prescriptions that will handle 80% of the cases. They're not too difficult to understand. And of course, you're not getting everything. And if you have an unusual case, you will not get enough to do that. But that's true in anything in life. That's true in anything in life. Take a book on sailboating. You'll have the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a well-respected Orthodox Lakewood rabbi, I don't know if I'm allowed to say the name, he had his smicha from Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he speaks in the same venue as one of the other Or Sameach rabbis, so we'll say there. He points out of Zohar that Rabbeinu HaKodesh states that 210 years before the Kates, the Tchias Mesim will happen. And since Tchias Mesim happens after Mashiach ben Dovid, which happens after Mashiach ben Yosef, this places Mashiach's arrival roughly before the English secular year of 2030. So, A, did Rabbeinu HaKodesh state that with Ruach HaKodesh? B, considering how burnt we've been through Jewish history with various Mashiach's arrival predictions, should we give this weight? C, this is Rabbeinu HaKodesh stating this, and I say this with the utmost respect, not a Stam Tana or some Rishon.
Who is Rabbeinu HaKodesh?
Rebbe.
He says this in the Zohar?
Yes. It's an argument between Rabbeinu HaKodesh and Rabbi Yitzchak whether or not Tchias Mesim happens 210 years before the Kates or 214 years before the Kates. Rabbeinu HaKodesh says 210 years, Rabbi Yitzchak says 214 years. And this is accounting that the Kates will be the year 6000.
Well, I like to see that Zohar, because Shimon Bar Yochai antedates the Mishnah by a lot. And it was an edited version of discussions in his yeshiva by Rabbi Abba, who was one of his Talmidim. So I'd be very surprised to find Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, that's what you mean by Rabbeinu HaKodesh, Rabbeinu Yossi quoted in the Zohar. I think there's something funny going on. That sounds to me very odd, number one. Number two, the Gemara curses people who will figure out the end. The Ramban had a date for the end, and other Rishonim had a date for the end, and the explanation they all give is, we know the conditions that are propitious for the end to occur, but we're not predicting it will occur. We're saying these are times when it can occur. You should take advantage of the time if you can, but we're not saying that it will occur. After all, our tradition tells us that Chizkiyahu HaMelech could have been Mashiach. Had he made a Shira, he would have been the Messiah, right? Just didn't happen. So we know there are times when it can happen, when the conditions are ripe, and if the right actions are taken, it could happen. But no one of these Rishonim who gave a date was violating the Gemara, not one. So their understanding was that you can describe a time which is propitious, but no one's making the prediction. And therefore, it's not a question of who's right and who's wrong, so they can both be right. And if they disagree, then it's a question of understanding what the propitious conditions are. But no more than that. It should not be understood as a prediction at all. We would not allow such a thing. If a person made a prediction like that, we would just discard him.
Just as a follow-up, I heard that, as an analogy, that the closer we get towards the end, we're allowed to kind of look into this. It's kind of like when one goes on a trip, you don't say, are we there yet, are we there yet?
I want a source for that. I know it's a Gemara. You're telling me the Gemara somehow becomes old-fashioned at a certain point? I'm not inclined to accept that without real sources. It sounds to me like, too, how shall I say, too folksy to be true. Yeah.
Should positions and rulings in the Gemara, or like halachic positions, be as intuitive as we would view like certain moral claims, like it is wrong to steal, murder, etc.? Like certain rulings, should it come to us like almost not naturally, but rather when we read it and we do further investigation, and it should be kind of like, oh yeah, this intuitively should make sense.
Absolutely not. Well, a ruling in the Gemara should make sense? Absolutely not. A ruling in the Gemara is a legal ruling. It's a ruling of what the sum total corpus of legal materials delivers as a conclusion in a particular case. It's an expression. What should, if you're good at learning, what should happen is this: when you look at all the legal background and then you look at the argumentation and then you see the decision it came to, you should be able to see that it's a logical conclusion from those premises. But not that the conclusion can stand on its own and say to someone in China, here, this is the truth, read it and accept it if you're fair. No, it's a legal ruling. It's not a, in fact, did I mention it here? I can't remember what I say wherever I am, but very often you'll have a statement in the Talmud, and you'll think about it, and you'll think, but that's not logical. And the answer is, it's not meant to be logical, it's meant to be a ruling of law. And in a legal setting, law trumps logic. Law trumps logic. Law has principles by which the law is articulated and applied, and if it doesn't agree with your mathematics, or it doesn't agree with your abstract logic, or doesn't agree with your science, that's because the law in this case doesn't care about your mathematics. It doesn't care. The law doesn't care, and therefore your mathematics is irrelevant, and your science is irrelevant, because the law is doing something else. The law is a system unto itself. I mean, for example, is it possible to have a case where the court decides a law in a way that they know is false? Could it be valid legally to do so when you know that it's false? Well, in contemporary American law, you have just such a principle. They don't teach it to you this way, but it is such a principle. Just imagine someone's accused of a crime, and there's a piece of evidence against him, which is submitted in court. It's a tape recording of his telephone conversation. You play it in court, it's clear to everyone that he's guilty, and then you find out there was no court order for the police to tap his phone. What happens in an American court? You have to throw out the evidence. It's the only piece of evidence, he goes free. Everyone knows he's guilty, but you can't use the knowledge, because the law says you can't use this knowledge. So you know it and you ignore it. You wouldn't do that in any other discipline, but here the legal rule is this knowledge can't be used, so you ignore it. This is a good example of how, and we have such a case in the Gemara because there was a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the rest of the members of the Sanhedrin, 70 against 1, and a voice from heaven proclaimed that Rabbi Eliezer was right, and they decided the law against him, knowing that the voice from heaven wasn't lying. The voice from heaven was expressing the law the way God authored it, the way God wanted it, and so forth and so on. But there's a verse in the book of Deuteronomy which says, Lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven, which means you can't use a voice from heaven as your reason for deciding the law. You have to use your understanding and your logic for a reason, even though when you know it's wrong. The legal rule is to use your reasoning and your understanding. So they decided the law against the voice from heaven. Because legal rules in a legal setting trump everything else. Nothing can be used against the law because you're trying to get a legal decision. It's very, very important to understand. It's a place where someone has a house, rented a house, and he breaks open a door for the house by cutting off a corner. And the width of the doorway is, let's say, 3 tefachim, or 3 amos, whatever it is, 3 units of length. And the prohibition in the contract is not to make an opening of 4 units of length. And Rashi says, well, look, you had a corner, right? So this was 2.5. This was 2.5, so the opening is 5. And Tosha says, excuse me, if this is 2.5, this is 2.5, diagonal is not 5. it's much less than that. Yeah, but the law was don't break open a door. And you broke down 5 units of wall in an L shape, and you violated the law. It's not the physical space of the opening, it's the legal description of the destruction that counts. So the law trumps everything. If you don't know the major legal premises, you're going to make a lot of wrong judgments about the logical status of the arguments in the Gemara. Yeah.
I'd like to preface my question with I've never even taken a peek into the text that I'm going to ask you about.
Okay. That's honest enough. Okay.
But back to the question about the oral Torah and the written Torah and how we can obviously inherently take that as the most true text that we have, so to say. Is there any validity or background from our Torah in the quote-unquote New Testament?
Well, you have to understand the New Testament of all things. The gigantic irregularity of the texts of the New Testament make it utterly, utterly unreliable. There are tens of thousands of variations in different texts of the New Testament. And some of them are, this is on the basis of their scholarship, and some of them affect matters of major doctrine, so that they have to sift through the manuscripts and try to figure out what to follow, what not to follow, so forth and so on. In the texts that we regard as part of our tradition, I saw an estimate on the outside of 40 letters out of over 300,000, none of which makes any difference in the meaning of the text. 40 letters. So we know that the fidelity of copying our texts is almost beyond belief. When you're copying 300,000 letters, and over 2,000 years, you have a variation of 40 letters, and none of them make any difference in the meaning of the text. You're talking about tremendous fidelity. So I'm not going to trust their much less accurately preserved traditions to be any indication of accuracy for mine. But what you want to see is the kinds of variations that there are. Yeah.
Just going back to the question, can the Rabbi also go over the reason for the Torah Shebechtav?
Say again? I didn't get.
Going back to the question, can the Rabbi also go over the reason for the Torah Shebechtav?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by the reasons for the Torah Shebechtav. I mean, judge of reliability as against what? That it was made up by the Maccabees? I mean, what are we?
I know the Rabbi often goes through the Kuzar argument, and that. So I meant like the main reason we have for the Torah Shebechtav, and our reason for accepting it, not against something else, just as the Torah being from Hashem, and just as that the main reason for that.
So but when I do the Kuzari argument, I'm talking about the revelation at Sinai. That's not exactly Torah Shebechtav. Torah Shebechtav means a book with five sections, and with particular words in particular order. That's Torah Shebechtav. It's a book. Now, I'm talking there about an event. I'm talking about the fact that the revelation of Sinai is a real event, not just a myth. That's the burden of the Kuzari argument. So they're not really on the same subject.
Okay, so the Kuzar argument, it shows that the national revelation that's for that argument.
That's right. The Kuzari argument is supposed to show good reason to believe that the description of the event at Sinai is describing a real historical event rather than a myth, as many ancient religions had myths about their ancestors and so forth and so on. We have good reason to believe that the revelation at Sinai was a real historical event.
Now, regarding the Torah Shebechtav in itself, what would be the reason for that?
Again, the reason for it, as opposed to what? As opposed to being made up by the Maccabees, as opposed to having amalgamated the way the biblical critics say. What am I fighting against? One of the basic rules in science is when you're gathering evidence for a particular hypothesis, it's evidence for this and against its competitors. If you don't know what its competitors are, you're shooting in the dark.
I mean, like, for example, like the national revelation, about the Zohar argument and how it's, the fact that it happened in front of masses.
Right.
I'm saying, like, you provide a reason for the national revelation. So too, I'm not asking like for like against something else. I'm asking for, unless the way of me asking is wrong. I'm asking for, because it seems like I'm asking.
But again, when I talk about the Kuzari argument, it's believing that the revelation of Sinai was a real historical event as opposed to being a myth. So there you have the two alternatives, the two possibilities. Now you're looking for evidence to decide between the two of them, right? So you're telling me, what reason do I have for the Torah Shebechtav? And I ask, as opposed to what?
I don't know what to.
Then I don't know what to do. I mean, when you gather evidence is supposed to distinguish between alternatives, right? And if I don't have an alternative, then I don't know how to assess what evidence is relevant, what evidence isn't relevant. That's not the way scientific investigations are done.
Like, for example, someone says like, we know that, like, the Torah Shebechtav is from Hashem. So then, what would be the reason for?
What's the reason for God doing it that way?
What's the reason for accepting it as from Hashem?
As opposed to what? As opposed to being made up by people, one person or many people? What historical period? Changing over time, amalgamating later? I mean, I need to know what the alternative is supposed to be, without which it's impossible to it's not a well-formed question. Yeah.
Just two questions. One quick follow-up. Just going back to Gemara, which you quoted about Torah Bashmaimi.
Yeah.
If that was the case, what was the point of the bus code? That was the first one. Second of all,
what did you say? What
was the point of the bus
Oh, I see. Okay.
And second of all, the point of the heavenly voice? And second of all, how do you reconcile modern medicine with saying God is the ultimate healer?
Oh.
Separate question.
Okay. That's sneaking two in for the price of one. We say, restore our judges as of old, and you alone should rule over us. So you could ask your question, we're going to have judges, what do you mean you alone should rule over us? And the answer is that they should represent you. They should act in your name. They should faithfully present to us the content of what you want us to do. And in that way, through their communication to us, you alone will be ruling over us. They just become your instruments. Now, we don't believe that doctors operate on their own. There's a wonderful story. One of the Rebbitzins, like 60 or 70 years ago, she had to do an operation, a life-threatening operation. And before she was put under anesthesia, she said to the surgeon, I want you to know that if I don't survive, I'm not holding you responsible. Because I believe that my life is in the hands of, the Creator. I'm not holding you responsible. Okay? And then she said, and if you succeed, I'm not crediting you either, because my life is in the hands of the Creator. It just deflate his ego a little bit, But that's it. The doctor is the one who's performing the operation, and it is God who is determining whether the person will live and will die. So there's no contradiction there whatsoever. If God doesn't want the person to live, the doctor won't succeed. If God wants the person to live, the doctor will succeed. So it's not a question of, there's no competition between the doctor and God.
Surely we understand how, let's say, drugs work, and we can do trials where we see that it's not random, the effects. We see that. We see the fact the drug works, and it's not being randomly sort of this person's.
The fact that surgery works?
No, the fact that the drugs.
The drugs. Oh, yes, but then, this is very interesting. They did a study, people prayed, this was in a fertility clinic, I think in Korea, where people were assigned all over the world to pray for certain patients, and the patients were identified only by number, and they kept statistics. One of the professors who ran it was a professor at Columbia. And the ones who were prayed for did better than the ones who did not. So this was published, and there's evidence that prayer has some effect. Then they tried to replicate it, and the replications failed. Well, in these kinds of things, there are always flukes. But then the fool said, so since the replications failed, that shows you that God is not involved. No, it doesn't show you that. You're dealing with the activity of an intelligent agent. He could hide, couldn't he? He could make sure that his effects are not visible when you're looking, because he doesn't want you to see them. The fact that you don't see doesn't mean it isn't there. It just means you didn't see because maybe you're dealing with an intelligent agent and he hid it from you. But if you do see, and it is statistically significant, then you do know that it's taking place. So it's not reciprocal both ways. So you can't when you're dealing with an intelligent agent, the fact that the drugs work or don't work is not going to rule out the activity of an intelligent agent. But now I skipped to your second question. The first question was?
What was the point of the heavenly voice?
Oh, the point of the heavenly voice was precisely to bring out this principle that lo b'shamayim hi, and to show you that the Rabbanim were not pushovers. They weren't superstitious of voices from heaven, which could twist them and influence them, and the law says, okay, we heard you. Not here. Don't come in here. You yourself told us not to come in here. We're not letting you in. I mean, this is, and by the way, the Gemara records that when they did that, God said to the angels, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated Nitzchuni banai, with great simcha, with great joy, because they followed the rule that he gave them to follow. Yeah.
I personally struggle with the terrible midah of laziness. There are many times that I could pick up a little part-time work here or there, but I'd rather just stay at home and watch a shir. Not because I'm a tzaddik, but because I'm incredibly lazy. Is it better for me to say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, or to try and overcome my laziness and go to work?
Overcome my laziness and go to work. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. By the way, Talmud Torah is the worst example of all. We have a principle: ha'osik mitzvah kapotim min mitzvah. A person who's doing a mitzvah doesn't break off doing that mitzvah when another mitzvah presents itself. Even if the mitzvah that he's doing has importance of 2, and the mitzvah that presents itself has importance of 8, he doesn't break off the mitzvah that he's doing now so as to do another mitzvah. Ha'osek b'mitzvah, poter min mitzvah. There's one exception: study of Torah. That one you break off. You stop and you go and do the other thing. So don't give me Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam as an excuse not to do. No, it's not. On the contrary. And the reason for it is because one principle built into Talmud Torah is I'm learning Torah in order to do. So when the opportunity to do comes, says, sorry, I'm learning, then you've lost it. The learning has lost its value. It's lost its direction, right? So certainly not. If in objective terms you have a meter of laziness and it's stopping you from doing things which otherwise you should do, then you have to work on that. One last remark of this is, Rav Desta makes this remark. The Gemara tells us that Hillel was so poor, he couldn't pay the coin to go into the Beis Medrash. That's the famous time he went up on the roof and he got snow on him and he was found frozen in the morning, and the whole thing, right? Okay, Hillel was brilliant, yes. Why did he hire himself out to IBM an hour a day to solve some sophisticated problems and live on that? Why did he become a wood chopper, which takes many, many hours per day, very poorly paid? Why did he do that? Don't tell me he was learning while he was chopping wood. It's not the same as being in the Beis Medrash, even for Hillel. So if that's the said, because he was working on a midah, the midah of chesed, of loving kindness. And one way you work on that midah is to make sure that in interaction with another person, an economic interaction, you give more than you got. But you can only give more than you got when there's an objective price. And there's no objective price for intellectual activity. It's not some market commodity which you can measure and then say, this is enough, this is too much, this is too little. Right? So he took wood, which is an absolutely trivial product, where it's all the wood is basically the same type and serves the same purpose and has absolutely objective price, so that he could work on his midah, his personality trait of generosity in an objective fashion, and he did that for whatever period of time he did it and kept himself outside of the Beis Medrash. He wasn't learning during that time. The Gemara says the purpose for which we're put in this world is to break our midos. And he says to break one midah is more difficult than learning all of Shas. So people who think that everything's learning the Rabbi Akiva Eiger, no, it's not everything. Certainly not everything. Yeah. Last question, yeah.
So there seems to be, to my knowledge, a subset of like modern biblical scholarship that tries to say that some of the stories in the Torah, like the flood and whatnot, or just copies of, let's say, the story of Gilgamesh or something like that. What is the response, I guess, to people who try to make those comparisons?
Yeah, one response is this. How do you date our story? So you date our story, according to these investigations. Yeah, you date it by the date of the text in which you find it. But that's a gigantic problem, because our way of life and our traditions and our information didn't come into existence at Sinai. God didn't gather some nomads from here and some Egyptian slaves from Ethiopia and from Syrians and some Greeks and pull them all together and say, hey guys, a new language, a new history, a new set of laws, a new religion, and so on and so on. This was going on for hundreds of years beforehand. It got written down in this book at this time, but that doesn't mean it originated at this time. So if you imagine that our tradition of the flood is 300 years older than the book, then it's before Gilgamesh, not after Gilgamesh. Right? So that's one false thing they do. They date the origin of our story with the origin of our book, and that simply ignores the history that we are talking about. And then with respect to the flood, almost all over the world there are flood stories. So, are they also copies of Gilgamesh? They vary in certain details, because it was a real event and because memory of it was preserved in many areas of the world. And then the memories became distorted in certain ways. And because Baruch gave us the Torah, he gave us the real story of how it happened. And that doesn't mean the other stories were copied from one another, or there's absolutely no reason to think that. Okay.